guides me. So I'm very, very privileged. And when I was speaking to my mentor about being here, she said, why don't you invite the people sitting there to notice their own body posture and notice what it would mean if they were sitting in such a way that they were open. They were really open to receive, open to offer. And so I wanted to just invite you for a moment just to notice how you've been sitting here, and how would that change if I was sitting right in front of you and we were in dialogue? And I invite you to shift your posture just to be open for this conversation that we're going to have. Thanks. So, conversation. What I'd like to do is actually have a conversation, not really go through a slide presentation, but I will, because that's what I was asked to do. Last year, I was invited to speak and introduce the open recovery paradigm. And because we had the benefit of the Surgeon General of the United States speaking, a conversation that was going to be between 25 and 45 minutes ended up being 11 minutes, and then I had forgotten my own eyeglasses, and so I couldn't read my notes. Anyway, to say that being invited back is a gift is an understatement, so I thank you for inviting me back. I hope you'll agree it's worth our time. Let's see if I do this. Okay, so with regards to disclosure, that's our conversation topic today. Here's my disclosure. I'm not a clinician and I'm not a scientist. I'm not a historian. I'm a woman in long-term recovery from alcoholism, and I'm I think was said, a fierce recovery advocate. I was told last night when I met some people that I was also a person that was really in your face last year. I had been told by an astrologer when I was in my early 20s that I was like an alarm clock, that I helped people get to where they want to be, or rather where they need to be, but they don't always like hearing me. So I'll be your alarm clock today, hopefully. So what I'm asking of you is to have a conversation with me and to bear in mind, what is my research, lived experience? What is my knowledge, history in this country of activism and advocacy? So what are we doing here today, or at least what am I doing here today, and what are our objectives? And it's really to say, what more can we do to end the stigma that is preventing millions of people from finding recovery from substance use disorders, right? The lucky ones are sitting in your offices, right? Those are the lucky ones that get your expertise, to get your guidance, to get your help. But we have tenfold the number of people who are not coming forward, or don't have access, or don't even recognize that they're struggling. So therefore, they're dying, right, and staying sick. So our conversation is, what more can we do to fight stigma? And so I want to ask you to consider adopting openness as a paradigm that could influence the elimination of stigma. And I'll introduce open recovery right now, how we're going to do that. So Open Recovery is the name of my organization. It was once the National Council on Alcoholism and Other Drug Addictions Bay Area. It's a health advocacy organization started in the 1950s, based in San Francisco, but inspired by the work of recovery advocate Marty Mann. And over the course of the 6 decades that we have been working in the community, we have gone from being a direct service provider to now being a health advocacy organization that's virtual. And we've done this because our purpose is to fill unmet needs. It's not to compete with other nonprofits. It's not to just get government funding so we can employ people. It's to fill unmet needs in the community so that more people can find recovery. And what Marty Mann did is she went across the country introducing herself openly as an alcoholic. And she identified publicly as a woman in recovery through Alcoholics Anonymous. That's not what I'm doing here today. I'm not here to advocate that people break anonymity if their path happens to be the 12 steps, not at all. What I'm here today is, what I'm doing is saying this is what recovery can look like. Instead of talking about alcoholism, I'm talking about recovery. And what I believe is all of us in this room are recovering from something, from heartbreak, from issues with worthiness, from difficult relationships with family members, from different kinds of diseases and illnesses. We're all recovering from something. We all can have the empathy of what does it mean to be in recovery. When I was a new member of my organization, I realized that our board of directors, not one of them had their name on our website. And when I asked them why, they said there was too much risk associated with their professional identity. Now, these are not medical professionals in the fields. These are business people in recovery who did not want their name on their LinkedIn profile or on our website associated with an organization that had the name or had the words addiction and substance use and drugs in their title. So, stigma is deep, fear is deep. Last year, when I came up on the stage, I asked the audience by show of hands, how many people here are in or identify as being in recovery and are ready to self-disclose? And I asked by way of show of hands. I'll do that again. How many people here feel comfortable identifying as a person in recovery from a substance use disorder? How many people here feel comfortable identifying as a person who is in recovery from something? Oh yeah, right? We're all in recovery. But what happened last year is that when I got off the stage, I was literally rushed, kind of breathlessly, by some people who said, oh my God, thank you so much for asking us to self-disclose. I have been in recovery decades in this field, and I have never told my colleagues. We don't have a culture in medicine of disclosure. Will you come and teach my staff and do a training and help us change our culture so we can self-disclose, not necessarily to our patients, but to each other? When I got the feedback from the conference, from conference members last year, one of the comments was they found it surprising and perhaps inappropriate that I should ask people to raise their hands. And what evidence did I have to support, to substantiate what I was asking? So I was really struck by the fact that at an addiction medicine conference with addiction medicine professionals, that asking one to identify, one who wants to, in any way would make anybody else feel uncomfortable. Under what circumstances would we want our colleagues to self-disclose to us something that's so relevant to the world that we work in and live in? I found that fascinating. And so I'm that much more excited to be back today, to be invited to ask us, or to be invited to talk about clinician self-disclosure. Open recovery as a paradigm can be a proud personal identity. I'm open about my recovery. And when I tell my story, I'm not self-disclosing, I'm not telling you about the horrors that I lived through when I was trapped in my disease. I'm talking about what it means to be a woman in recovery today, openly, proudly, healthily, right? I'm showing people when I speak what recovery can look like. And we know there are, 23 million people in recovery from a substance use disorder, so there are 23 million data points that what recovery can look like and that recovery is possible. But we don't hear about it, we don't see it very often. Recovery can also be, as I said before, or it was on an earlier slide, a shared value. We want, in our environment, recovery-conducive, recovery-friendly cultures, policies, structures in place that support people to sustain recovery, that prevent people from relapsing, might even prevent people from progressing in their usage into addiction. Recovery can be perhaps even a treatment goal. The idea that recovery is not the cessation of use, but it's also the integration of an identity that doesn't have shame, that it's the integration of those states, that if I can be open with discretion, with discernment, considering my audience, that it helps me have an integrated identity of health and wellness. That's part of the reason I used, because I didn't have that mental health. I didn't know how to feel. The reason I reached for use, the reason I reached for substance is I didn't know how to belong. I didn't know how to experience love. I didn't know how to self-soothe. The fact that I had the disposition, to become an addict is not the reason I reached for it. But what happened was that when I became a blackout drinker and when I woke up and realized I was doing things that was harming myself and people I loved and complete strangers when I was driving drunk, I didn't know how to recognize that. I didn't know how to self-disclose, how to identify, how to ask for help. So I had tremendous shame because I was doing things that I knew was bad, and I had no role models of people in my life, teachers, coworkers, family members that said, yeah, I'm also struggling and here's the path I'm on. Or, oh yeah, I used to have that. I'm a person in recovery. Here's the path I take. Or there are lots of paths because there was so much stigma and so much silence. Open recovery can be a call to action, right? It can be, let's be open. It's Recovery Month this month, right? Let's be open on social media and just be an advocate, an ally, right? We stand for recovery whether we're disclosing our own. So what does that mean? That means I'm a safe person to talk to. That means I believe in doing the work in my community or in my organization or in my family that can support recovery. And it can be just an affront to stigma, you know, saying I'm in open recovery, putting those two words together, that goes, it's juxtaposed, you know, this whole idea of anonymity. And again, I'm not asking people to break anonymity, but I'm saying I am open and I will not have stigma, shame, and fear define my recovery. So a lot of what history shows us, standing up, being open, can be very liberating. We know, and I'll talk about in a little while, some of the social justice movements and health initiatives that required people who were disenfranchised, who were marginalized, to come forward and find their voice and to put a human face on something that was stigmatized. That coming forward, they put themselves at tremendous risk. I mean, you remember, you probably lived it, some of you know it. Coming forward as a person with HIV, you're going to lose your job, you're going to lose your friends, you're going to lose access to health care. Coming forward as a person who is a homosexual, you're going to lose your job. You're going to lose relationships with family. You're going to lose your relationships, your security, and community. Most recently, coming forward as a woman who has been harassed sexually in the workplace, silent victims. We had no power. But the individuals who said, "Me too," the individuals who said, "Come out," the individuals who said, "Silence equals death," they put their personal security at risk for public health, for all of that injustice, so that more people could have access, so that more people could have treatment, so that more people could have protection, right? And so that's part of what I'm talking to you about today. Your voice, your advocacy, your willingness to be open in whatever form you have influence to move this process along so more people can find access to recovery and live in sustained recovery. Liberation. Is that possible in the medicine field, in the medical field? So what we know is that medical doctors are twice as likely to have a substance use disorder than the general population. We know, according to the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention, proportionately, twice as many doctors will die by suicide this year than the general public. The mental health of medicine professionals is considered to be at a crisis. We are in a culture where we are not allowed to show signs of weakness. We believe that our being an expert with our clients, that infallibility, that perfection, that expertise somehow influences the likelihood that they will be healthier or well. So we're in a culture that doesn't allow medical professionals to show that they are sick or that they need help. but they're at higher risk. So we know proportionally that 10 to 15% of the people in this room are actively struggling. Your peers around you are actively struggling. Just as many are actively in some form of recovery. But the consequences that you face by coming forward, whether to ask for help or once you are in recovery, which is so interesting because whether you're in crisis or already stable, you face backlash, right? You can be disbarred. You can lose your reputation. You fear that you will lose the respect of your clients or your patients. The toll this takes for you to be open is annihilation. So we're in a field, and I say we, though I'm speaking about you, are in a field where you are meant to help people get well, but you are not allowed to be sick. Well, what if you're sick, you're full of shame or secrecy? You have to know that you can be sick and you can get well. You have to know, right? Again, I want this to be a conversation. I don't pretend to know the answers. All I can say is, here's the data, right? This field is disproportionately impacted with mental health disorders and disproportionately at a disadvantage to get well. What can we do if we're not ready to come forward? Yesterday I met somebody who was at the conversation last year, who said, I still have your wristbands that were on every table. I keep it in my car. I'm hoping to be able to pass it out. And I have been grappling all year whether I can come out. I think it's too risky in California to come out. I serve in too many leadership roles to come out. When a doctor who is so well trained fears losing their livelihood, what is the toll? What if they do come out and then they lose the ability to practice? I mean, the tremendous loss on so many levels, not just ruining one life, but all the help that they could provide and all the change. There is something fundamentally, structurally wrong. And I want to suggest this stigma against weakness, this stigma against addiction, which shows up in recovery, is the discrimination itself that we have to fight against. If we want to be practicing and living what we're working for in the community, we need to know that there's congruence in our work environment as well. We want to be healthy individually. We want to be healthy with our clients to support their well-being. We want health for our colleagues. We need health in our institutions and our organizations. We can influence that change, each one of us. So after I was in the New York Times, I was contacted by many, many physicians across the country saying the same thing that people here told me last year, which is, I have been in recovery and I cannot come out. Or, I was arrested, I was forced to go into treatment, and now I can't find a job even though I've been in recovery 5 years. This idea of physician heal thyself, right? I mean, is it possible? What does it mean? What can you do? How are you supposed to do this? Now, yesterday I know that one of our presenters stood up before she gave her talk and identified herself as a woman in recovery. And then she talked about her expertise as a doctor. Anybody in this room now knows if they have concerns about themselves or a loved one, they know somebody they can go talk to, yes? That act of identifying, she put her reputation and potentially her medical professional stability at risk to be of service. Highest good. What are we here to do? Highest good. What are we here to do? She also told me, this doctor who made that disclosure yesterday, that as a result of talking to patients and telling them that she is in recovery, she's able to get a more thorough history of use and therefore able to make a diagnosis or make a recommendation about course of action. She says that the interns that she's working with without fail, come up to her afterwards and say, hey, I want to tell you about a family member, or what should I do about this or that? If we are in an environment that we have colleagues and institutions where we know they're allies and are safe, we are more likely to get help ourselves and to get help for the ones that we love. So weighing the risks and benefits of self-disclosure. So let's talk about to whom. So I defer to you in your own conversations with your colleagues about what's appropriate with your clients. I had a conversation with Dr. Gabor Mate, who spoke to me about, in his experience, speaking with his patients, his ability to identify as somebody who has has an addiction associated with his shopping, allows him to be human, and for him, in his experience, that humanity is part of what helps create a healing environment and trust, which also models for his clients what open communication and honest communication with healthy boundaries is, and issues of transference and countertransference he's adept at dealing with. So he talked about, in his experience, he believes highest good at this point with clients is being human, one human to another, so that patient can look at you and say, if you, my doctor, my infallible doctor, can identify as being in recovery in some way, then I'm not that bad, or there's hope for me. And it doesn't mean we're now best friends or I want to hear your story. We each need to deal with our own stuff, right? We each need to know our boundaries. That was his experience that he shared with me. And he said to me, Faye, the medical community is full of fear. And when we think about how we work with our clients, what drives us? Fear? Love? Hope? Service? If we look at all of the implications, what can happen, the backlash of what can happen if we come forward to disclose, no doubt about it, financially, legally, reputationally, risk mitigation, do not disclose. But if we look at health advocacy and health advancement, look at public health efforts, if we do not disclose to our colleagues, to our employers, we serve no one. We are operating out of fear. And we are operating out of self-preservation, which makes sense. But again, we have to ask, where in our lives, where can we do the most good? Where can we use the power that we have as physicians, as esteemed members of our community, to influence change, to use our voice and our lived experience? The other thing to think about with disclosure is that we have colleagues, as we said, we have colleagues who are struggling, we have colleagues in recovery, we have colleagues who are concerned about their loved ones. We have colleagues who are impacted about the use of, they are impacted by their own colleagues' use, right? They're impacted by those colleagues that show up who are hungover or maybe still high, but they don't want to report them because they know that'll end a career, but then they have to cover for them. More than 45% of you are dealing daily with this in your own life as a physician, not with your patients. So disclosure, coming forward, saying not just there's an issue, but there are solutions. And if I disclose and say, yeah, I'm a person in recovery, does that mean I have a bias, as it was said earlier? Yeah, of course it means I have a bias. We all have biases. I'm female, I have a bias. I'm white, I have a bias. But we know there are many paths. This is a spectrum illness. There's a spectrum of solutions. And hopefully, as an expert and as a professional, I can give you counsel and guidance about options. That is freedom, when you have the option to choose. Another thing I want to talk about in terms of disclosure is once we have dealt with our own disclosure, which helps to create self-esteem and integrated identity, we can then work for the structural changes that need to happen in our policies. And then we can look at our professional biases. And apparently, according to some recent studies, clinicians who were shown vignettes of patients who were identified as drug abusers were more likely to suggest they deserve some punitive response, as opposed to the same clinicians who were given the same vignettes, and those patients were referred to as people with substance use disorder, right? The language we use influences our bias, influences how we respond to people. Stigma is so entrenched, it's not just what will people think of me, it's how do I treat them. So who heals are healers. So what we do know is that doctors who do go through a board-directed recovery program have an extraordinarily high rate of achieving recovery and sustaining recovery, 75 to 80%. I mean, it's nearly double that of the general population. But in a field where we're not allowed to recognize our own vulnerability or come forward with vulnerability, that's a tremendous challenge. So how do we overcome stigma? What we as an organization did is we looked at the social justice movements that I spoke about before, and we looked at those individuals who came forward and identified and were open and inspired change, policy change, legal change. What we do as an organization is we put images of health and wellness out into the social media and to the general public, and we say that's recovery. We make recovery aspirational. We support events that aren't rallies on the state capitol against. We put together events and collaborate on events that are about health and wellness. What is recovery? It's health and wellness. It's maintaining wellness and health. It's about connection. We work with organizations to go in and say, how can we change the culture here? We need to look at what management practices are. We need to look at what our policies are, what our benefits are, structurally, interpersonally, and personally. It starts with courage to ask for help or to offer help. Here's the behind the curtain. The act of putting on the wristband, the act of saying I'm an ally, the act of saying I'm open. And again, to talk about solution, you don't need to be open to talk about what it was like. No one needs to qualify. It's enough to say, I'm open. With discernment, to the right audience, at the right time, that is advocacy. When we're open, we change our narrative. We stop being identified as the illness. We start being identified as the person with the lived experience that is evidence of what is possible. We become inspiration. We become hope. We become open to collaborate. So I asked you before, in the service of the highest good, why are you here? What are you doing? We have 23 million people in recovery. Each one of them can show us a path to sustained recovery. We need to invite them to be open, to come forward. Disproportionately, they're in this field. Why are we silent? What can we do? So I invite you to consider embracing, adopting some element of this open recovery paradigm. Proud identity, shared value, affront to stigma, treatment goal. What can you do personally in your relationship with your patients, in your relationships with your clients, in your relationships with your colleagues, in relationships to the leadership positions and institutions you serve on boards? What can you do? So instead of, next time, instead of being told, like, how dare you bring that up and make me feel uncomfortable, might it be, wow, yes, thank you for showing me what's possible. Thank you for allowing me to talk about something that I otherwise wouldn't have. Thank you for showing me that safety is right here in this medical community so that we can all be well. Do well, be open. Thank you.
Thank you, Faye. I feel so fortunate to be able to have you back, and also fortunate to have a couple of minutes for questions, if that's okay. The first question is about wellness and burnout, which we hear a lot about. So, do you think the growing emphasis on physician wellness and burnout prevention, even early in training, will help aid in decreasing stigma? If not, how can we change this education early on?
Right, it's a really important question. My understanding is today 50% of all doctors are in burnout actively, 50%. So half of you in this room know exactly what that question was about. And I believe that during residency, there's something like 5% people struggle with stress. By the end of residency, 35 have a major depressive disorder. I mean, I'm exaggerating, I don't know the data, but I have read that burnout is real. And I know in organizations that aren't medical organizations, on average, only 4% of employees take sick days. But on average, employees take 4 days of sick days, but on average, they take 58 days where they are present but completely distracted, so therefore ineffective. It's called presenteeism. That's what's happening with our doctors. You're burnt out, you're at work, you're not able to concentrate, you're at conferences like this, not able to take this in because you're so distracted and exhausted, right? So physician health and wellness, I believe, needs to absolutely be taught in medical school, the issues of stigma, the issues of wellness. But again, I'm not a medical professional. I don't have enough insight into your industry. I only know what the data suggests. But I invite you to bring in outsiders with beginner's mind, people like me and other advocates who can help you look at what you could do differently to humanize the fact that you need help, you need support, and that will make you better in your careers, right? Better physicians.
Our next question has to do with 12-step, actually. And the question is there dialogue between open recovery and the 12-step program about disclosure?
Thank you. It's a really important question, too. And, in terms of stigma, I know not only in the medical field, but also in the recovery community, there's a lot of tension between medically assisted recovery and 12-step recovery and spiritual recovery and agnostic recovery. And, this dialogue, I believe, should be yes and, not no but. Okay, let's do more research, but and in the meantime, we have enough evidence that this helps those people that it helps, and this helps those people that it helps. Open recovery is inclusive. It's a paradigm that says, I'm open to whatever path works for you, my colleague, my peer, my patient. I'm here to support your wellness. What works for me may not work for you, and I'm open. All I can do is share my own experience, strength, and hope. I'm not a physician. You have much more access to data about what works, and you have access to patients to know what works. But if we do a yes and, I believe more people will live because we have treatment centers that are only 12-step, but with an opioid use disorder, we know that they might be more responsive to treatment like buprenorphine. I think I'm saying that right. The biases we have limit pathways. We need spectrum of recovery pathways. So is there dialogue? There has to be dialogue, and I believe it starts with yes and.
We have time for one more question. You mentioned, of course, that recovery is a process and people find themselves at different stages. This question asks, do you think it's appropriate for physicians to self-disclose to patients or colleagues about their own use if they are not yet in recovery and plan to keep using, or only once they're on the recovery path?
Great question. I encourage people who are using, who think they might have a problem, to seek a colleague or a confidant or an expert with whom they can talk to safely. Safely. We need to feel safe. Disclose for the sake of disclosure does no one any good unless you are supported and feel safe, right? So I think each one of us needs to be able to discern when the timing is right, informed by our guidance. informed by the norms. And I think it's important to ask, to what end? Is this going to be valuable to my client, to my patient? Why am I disclosing? Highest good? Is it ego? Is it desperation? Is it because there's value here? So I can't pretend to know the answer. I don't think, as was said to me last night, you're a person who's in our face. We don't need to wear things on our sleeve. We have to know how to do discernment, right? We need to know when it's appropriate to disclose anything. But if we think if we're contemplating, it usually means there's an issue, in my experience. Find someone that you can speak to safely to get support. Don't disclose to your patients. Don't seek comfort from your patients. Seek comfort from colleagues or experts or peers outside of the hospital setting. That's my recommendation. Thank you.
And that's all the time we have. Thank you so much, Faye.